des produits, pour aussi dire, des reports et des câbles issus de la diplomatie américaine, surtout dans les périodes de naissance du split de la division, de l'émergence de la division entre État islamique de l'Afrique de l'Ouest et Boko Haram lié à Chekau. Et pour terminer, les sources ici présentées ont été aussi comparées avec des interviews avec des acteurs clés, comme Kim First, aussi en anglais, au Niger. Voilà les premiers points. De ma présentation, c'est lié à la relation plutôt difficile, pour ainsi dire, entre Aboubakar Chekau, la personne qu'on a présentée, et qui était le visage le plus connu de Boko Haram jusqu'à sa mort récemment en 2021, et un autre personnage très important dans l'histoire du développement de la cohérence doctrinale de Boko Haram et du phénomène djihadiste autour du lac Tchad. Ça veut dire Mohamad Mamanour. Ce personnage qui était d'une certaine importance, surtout au début de l'expérience djihadiste à Borno State, dans l'état de Borno, a été un camarade d'Oustaz Youssouf dans les tout débuts, et est devenu un personnage clé, surtout dans le moment de l'émergence d'ISWAP, de l'État islamique d'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et la relation entre 2005 et 2018 a été analysée en lumière de certaines interviews menées avec des supporters de Boko Haram de la période, entre 2005 et 2009 surtout. Et pour la partie plus récente de leur relation entre 2000 et 2018, ça a été basé surtout sur les documents produits par l'État islamique de l'Afrique de l'Ouest et leurs alliés. Mais la question majeure autour de laquelle s'est passé les débats ou la dispute, si vous voulez, entre Nour et Chekau, c'était la question de l'usage du takfir ou de la excommunication, et surtout du takfir musalsal ou du takfir sérial, on peut dire comme ça. Je ne sais pas la bonne traduction de l'arabe, mais plus ou moins, ça veut dire un takfir qui mène à un autre takfir, qui mène à un autre takfir. Et la question a été surtout analysée par Nour dans un document dont le titre c'est l'exposé de Chekau. C'est un document audio dans lequel il invite les combattants de Boko Haram à performer, je ne sais pas si c'est français, à performer l'Hijra ou à abandonner les territoires contrôlés par Chekau, en l'invitant aussi à s'établir dans une autre communauté plus cohérente au niveau doctrinal. Et en deuxième, la chose intéressante de la dispute entre Nour et Chekau, c'est la question de l'usage du ghanima ou du butin capturé au cours des raids. La question de ghanima ou spoils of war en anglais. Et en utilisant surtout une lecture liée aux études islamiques et à l'islamologue, en gros, les premiers résultats de cette analyse nous a amené à conclure que l'utilisation de la question du takfir et c'était lié un peu c'était comparable à la question de la shirk ou de l'adoration des polythéistes. Pardonnez la traduction un peu grossier, et c'était l'utilisation d'un domaine religieux, d'un domaine lié à din, à religion, pardonnez, c'était l'utilisation d'un lexicon, d'un vocabulaire lié au fiqh, à la jurisprudence, au droit, dans son milieu religieux. Et du coup, il y avait, comme vous voyez, un bouleversement un peu de termes. Un deuxième, la prochaine slide, merci. The next one, merci. Ah non, la 7. The 7, yeah, ok. C'était lié à la question de... Non, c'est pas ça. C'est... Oui, voilà, c'est cela. J'ai 3 minutes. Il faut que je me dépêche. Alors, c'était la question aussi à l'établissement de l'État islamique, ou la question du Dawla. L'État islamique a été déclaré par les Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi en Syrie en 2015. Et ça a créé des conséquences aussi au niveau local, au niveau des wilayas de l'État islamique en Afrique de l'Ouest, même si la distance et le détachement géographique entre les deux communautés de combattants et de croyants, il y avait une circulation intéressante du débat religieux, en gros. Et ça, pour synthétiser, c'était lié à deux positions qui sont émergées au sein de l'État islamique en Syrie et en Irak, autour de deux figures essentielles du débat, dans l'État islamique. Ces figures sont Ahmad al-Azimi, qui est un peu le créateur de la question du takfir, de l'excommunication de ceux qui excusent. Ça veut dire un personnage qui tendait à faire du takfir musalsal, du takfir serial. Et de l'autre côté, le groupe aussi dit des binalistes liés à un imam d'origine qatari nommé Bin Ali, qui proposait une autre catégorie juridique et religieuse pour comprendre la position des musulmans qui ne se trouvent pas à vivre dans un contexte gouverné par la charia, par la loi islamique. Et proposer l'idée de Dar al-Kufr al-Tari, qui, je ne sais pas comment bien traduire en français, mais en anglais, on l'a traduit comme l'absent abode of unbelief, qui c'était en gros une catégorie créée pour accommoder les positions des musulmans qui ne vivent pas dans des territoires gouvernés par la charia. C'était, comme vous voyez, une séparation, comment dire, une dispute entre un côté un peu plus modéré et un côté un peu plus radical, si vous voulez, ou extrémiste. C'est aussi vrai que la courant azimiste était aussi nommé dans les documents officiels comme des roulous, des extrémistes, effectivement. Et ça démontre un peu la pendularité, ce qu'on a appelé la pendularity, de la circulation de la leadership de l'État islamique entre des positions plus modérées et des positions un peu plus radicaux. Et on peut aller à la prochaine aussi parce que... next one, please. Comme ça, je vais un peu plus vite. Et en tout dernier, je promets, ça c'est la dernière, la question liée à l'enlèvement des filles, des écoliers de la petite ville d'Apchi, qui a été menée en février 2018 par un bataillon de l'ISWAP, de l'État islamique de l'Afrique de l'Est, et qui est un événement qui reflète un peu cette division qui s'est créée au sein de l'État islamique central en Syrie et en Irak, mais qui se reflète aussi dans les positions des différents intellectuels et combattants de l'État islamique en Afrique de l'Ouest, au Nigeria, autour du lac Tchad. Ça va sans dire, les questions importantes sont toujours liées à la doctrine, mais aussi liées à Al-Ghanima, au butin de guerre. Et ce type de rift, de division qui s'est développé entre Nour et Shekau a causé en gros la mort de Nour, du premier, qui a été accusé d'être accommodant par rapport vis-à-vis du gouvernement nigérien. Il a été exécuté par le conseil de Shura. Et on a interprété les documents qui ont été produits par la leadership du SWAP dans ce moment-là autour de la question du destin de Mama Nour pour comprendre en relation avec la division au sein de l'État islamique central en Syrie entre les groupes des binalistes et les groupes des azimistes, ça veut dire les extrémistes et les modérés. Je termine avec les conclusions qui, vous voyez, sont plutôt denses. Je vais essayer de synthétiser. Le calife al-Baghdadi en Syrie et en Irak avait essayé de bâtir de construire sa légitimité, autorité dans les milieux djihadistes à travers un renforcement de la division entre foi, iman, et kufr. En français, c'est comment? and unbelief, let's say. Là, une cohérence liée un peu à les nécessités de guerre et les nécessités religieuses ont amené la leadership du SWAP à se disputer et a aussi amené à la mort de plusieurs représentants des deux côtés de cette. Okay. Entre deux slides de conclusion, mais je vais directement à celle plus importante, que c'est la conclusion 2. Et la conclusion, et ça c'est la vraie conclusion, comme ça je vous laisse libre, c'est que la tendance à utiliser plus de takfir amène à produire un leadership militaire plus assertif et des militants qui sont plus motivés, pour ainsi dire, parce qu'ils ont des objectifs réels, des objectifs concrets, et un sens de camaraderie que c'est plus fort. Mais il amène aussi à plusieurs problèmes, à plusieurs risques. En tout premier, il va multiplier le nombre de cibles ad infinitum, comme on dit en latin, et amenant à l'isolement stratégique du mouvement de base. Et en deuxième, ça va aussi exposer la leadership et les groupes et le mouvement à plus d'instabilité à l'intérieur du mouvement, parce que ça va créer plusieurs divisions. Je crois que c'est mieux si je m'arrête ici, sinon je vais vraiment monopoliser. Merci bien.
Ok, merci Alessio. Le sujet que vous abordez est très passionnant. Il questionne la gouvernance djihadiste et la gouvernance dans les espaces occupés par Boko Haram autour du lac Tchad. Et à partir d'un certain nombre de sources, dont les discours produits par Shekau, par Barnawi, par Anour, il essaye donc de voir les divergences qui se sont posées et qui ont également provoqué des conflits en interne entre les leaders et comment gérer cet espace occupé-là. Donc, nous allons passer tout simplement au prochain exposant en disant que vous gardez vos questions et tout à l'heure, vous pourrez davantage questionner Alessio. Donc, le prochain intervenant, c'est Feisal Farah, qui vient de l'université de Mr. Farah, you have 15 minutes and we are listening to you. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great. Okay, I promised that I was talking about the evolution of political Salafism in the coast of Kenya. And I'll start by just giving an introduction to it. Has been fertile ground for Islamic radicalism for a long time. The Al-Shabaab, of course, found it a little bit easy to recruit. What I've done is that I've taken three three personnel, three persons to describe the evolution of Salafism in East Africa. These three people that I've chosen, they come from different periods of time. The first one that I've chosen to highlight is going to be Sheikh Ali Mazrui. If you can first show us the map, one of the maps. So this is the Swahili coast, of course, you can see stretches from southern part of what is today Somalia and all the way down to Mozambique, the Comoro Islands, and some parts of Madagascar. So all of that is part of the Swahili coast. When the discussion about Sheikh Ali Mazrui, Sheikh Ali Alamin al-Mazrui, he's the father of the famous political scientist Ali Mazrui. And he was born in 1891 and died in 1947. He was, he was born 4 years before the establishment of colonialism in what is today Mombasa. And then, of course, at that time, it was part of the Sultanate of Zanzibar. So colonialism starts in 1895 in that area. And this is when he is about 4 years old. So he is more or less a product of colonialism, British colonialism, because he is born, he is raised in colonialism and dies while still colonialism goes on. So Ali Mazroui's we will look at how his life coincides with, of course, colonialism in Kenya. And then I'll follow that in the half a century later to discuss Sheikh Khalid Balala. Sheikh Khalid Balala is a preacher who, of course, starts his activism during the Daniel Arap Moi's regime. Was an oppressive regime, and he eventually, of course, will face different kinds of problems, but he's still around he's still alive, he's still a political activist in Kenya. And then, of course, the last personality that I'll be speaking about is Abu Drogo Mohamad, who was accused to be a member of Al-Shabaab, a supporter of Al-Shabaab, who was born in 1968 and was killed in 2012 by police, an anti-terrorist unit in Somalia. So let's, a little bit of background about East Africa is that during that time, of course, Mombasa was part, or the coast of East Africa was part of what is then Zanzibar. And the British, of course, made a protectorate of it. And eventually this will be included, will become Kenya when Kenya becomes independent in 1963. So the personality, let's just go straight to Sheikh Ali Mazrui. If we can switch, please. So that is Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia in the background. Yes, and the next, yeah. So this is Sheikh Ali Amin al-Mazrui, father of the famous political scientist Ali Mazrui. He started his education in Mombasa by one of his uncles who taught him, and eventually ended up going to Zanzibar for further education. Eventually, he was able to be influenced by Egyptian scholars and reformists, people like Mohamad Abdo and Rashid Reza, and who, of course, used to edit a journal. And this journal, I think the Sheikh had access to some of these journals that were brought to him. Sheikh Al-Amin, of course, was very interested in the ideas that were coming out of Egypt. And Egypt, of course, was facing more or less the same colonial power. The British were in Egypt at that time. At the same time, they were also in Kenya. So from the teachings of Rashid Reza and Abdo, he came to understand that it was futile to fight against the British and to accept some of the ideas that the British were I mean, that Western thought was not in conflict with Islam. He thought that Muslims could take this as understanding of, you know, sort of an advanced form of Islam, kind of something that people like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, and Al-Ghazali had already set, you know, set a standard for, and eventually, of course, perfected by the Europeans who will come later to use. Sheikh Al-Amin, of course, he in East Africa followed more or less the same ideas of Sheikh Reza by downplaying or minimizing the colonial or Western thoughts that were coming into East Africa. So he minimized that, and he encouraged Muslims, Muslim boys and Muslim girls to go to schools, regular schools like everybody else, so that they can get educated. And one of the things, one of the ways, of course, that Sheikh Ali Mazrui was able to influence people was he had two newspapers. He published two Kiswahili that were written in Kiswahili, something that was very new at that time. Two newspapers that were written in Kiswahili that challenged the authorities. He was a reformist. According to Kai Kressa, he was a kind of a modernist reformist. So he was taking some of the colonial projects into his thing. So one of the things that he challenged was he challenged Muslim traditions, Islamic traditions, Sufi kind of traditions that were in the Islamic, in the coast of Kenya. He challenged these things like the celebrations of the birthday of the Prophet, the Mawlid, some of the visitation of graves. All of these are things that he had challenged. So his newspaper, of course, he used all of this in the 1920s and the 1930s as a guide for the Muslim Ummah. And he used, and one of the things that he did was he was encouraging Muslims to return to the roots of Islam. So he can be seen as being one of the first Salafists, earlier Salafists of the coast of Kenya. And some of the things that he intended to use, the concept that he was using were ijtihad and maslaha, where they could translate or retranslate the original texts into modern context. So he was trying to sort of kind of renew sort of Islam but within a colonial system. So eventually, of course, he also prophesied, and this was something that was feared among many people on the coast, is that one day maybe those people who have adopted European education in the hinterlands of Kenya will eventually be able to become more powerful than the people of the coast. So he encouraged them to go to school. But a lot of the people condemned his prophecy that this was going to happen. But eventually, after independence, this prophecy that he had made many years before colonialism came into fruition. So Sheikh Ali Mazrui can be said to be, but most of the people, of course, saw Sheikh Ali Mazrui to be a product of British colonialism. He was seen as somebody who was an elitist, somebody who came, of course, from a family that is well known already. He became Chief Qadi he was the Qadi of Mombasa in 1932. And in 1934, he became the acting Chief Qadi. 1937, he became the Chief Qadi. And for 10 years, until his death in 1947, he was the Chief Qadi of Kenya, of the coastal parts of Kenya. And his influence, of course, continued after independence. Some of the people that he had influenced were his students. Among them, of course, was the famous Qadi of Kenya, Sheikh Abdullah Saleh Al-Farsi, and Harith Saleh Nasser, and many others who eventually, of course, he had influenced. So his influence, of course, continued, but did not turn out to be, there was nothing radical. It was within the government system that was working then. Either colonialism or the Kenyan government came after colonialism. But in 1979, something happened that, of course, changed some of the things that were going on not only in Mombasa, but most of the Islamic world, and that was the Iranian Revolution that happened in 1975, and the response that the Saudi government had towards this and its effect on the coast of Kenya. But instead of the fighting becoming between Shi'is and Sunnis in the coast of Kenya, the fight was between Sunnis themselves, where those who were following traditional Islamic of Mombasa were fighting against new kind of reformists who are coming in from Saudi Arabia, either educated in universities like Medina, or some of them, of course, coming from other parts of the Gulf who had come. So the conflict eventually started, discussions about what is Wahhabism, Salafism. People were attacking each other, and eventually some of the traditions were considered to be bid'ah. And by the 1990, that form of Salafism was in full swing. But then at the same time, if we go to the 1990s, if we can change to Sheikh Balala. Yeah, go ahead. Just switch to there's a picture of Sheikh Balala there. So in the 1990s, this preacher here is a fiery preacher called Khalid Balala, Sheikh Khalid Balala. Sheikh Khalid Balala, of course, will come to prominence in 1990s because of the multi-party. Kenya from 1963 to 1990, 91 was a one-party system. We only had one party. The KANU, Kenya National Union Party, was the only party that was in existence. And from then onwards, multi-party started in 1992. And one of the people of the coast proposed that they would want an Islamic party. An Islamic Party of Kenya was formed, but this was immediately banned by the government because of the name Islam that was in it. So this period of time is known as the second liberation. This comes after the liberation, comes after independence. So the independence was first liberation, second liberation comes in 1990 when we allowed to have multi-party system. But of course, the government of Moi at that time banned the IPK, Islamic Party of Kenya. And of course, the complaints that were being brought up by people like Khalid Balala was they were not necessarily Islamic. They were mostly secular issues, things like treating human rights, treating Muslims as second citizens, treating people as second citizens, and also education for marginalized Muslims. Oh God. Anyway, the last person that I will discuss very quickly, I didn't know that it will take so, is Sheikh Rogo. Sheikh Rogo, of course, if you can put the last picture. Sheikh Rogo, of course, was born in 1968, died in 2012. He was killed. I mean, he, of course, openly supported jihad that was going on in Somalia. He was a preacher at a mosque called Masjid al-Musa in Mombasa. And he was, of course, things had changed after 2011. And he was accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda. And eventually, he came out and said that he supported the jihad that was going on in Somalia and encouraged a lot of Muslims in Mombasa to travel to Somalia and join the jihad there. So, of course, the government was not happy. He was taken to court many times, and many times he was able to come out of that court. But unfortunately, I don't know if fortunately or fortunately, he was eventually gunned down by the police forces. So to conclude, is that Mombasa is a place, of course, of long history of reform, battles between Salafist and traditionalist Islam. But one thing that the Al-Shabaab was able to do is already find that the people of Mombasa were not happy with what was going on in Kenya. They found themselves to be marginalized economically and also in terms of education and work. So they took this opportunity sort of to mobilize and get people recruited into what is Al-Shabaab today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Farah. Et à travers son exposé, nous avons vu la relation qu'il a entre le groupe Al-Shabaab et puis les différents réseaux islamistes, n'est-ce pas, dans la côte kenyane. Et cela nous a permis également de voir que les problèmes que nous vivons dans la zone du lac Tchad ne sont pas seulement dans cette zone-là, et ils se vivent également dans d'autres espaces comme dans la côte orientale de l'Afrique. Donc, on pourra revenir dans les échanges pour aller un peu plus en profondeur. Il y a un micro qui se balade pour les questions. Vous voulez intervenir? You want to say something before Professor Lovejoy? OK. Donc, une série de questions. Et please, adressez vos questions à l'un ou l'autre de manière précise. Soyez direct et bien court dans la façon de poser vos questions. Merci. Alors, oui.
Thank you very much. My observations and questions goes to the second presenter, my friend Feisal. I want you to know to highlight much about the publications of Sheikh Mourier, because during the course of your presentation, you made mention that you set up newspaper publications, and what I'm not clear of is you're talking about the coast, and then you are talking about some of the islands on the Indian Ocean. You just made mention of Zanzibar, and you know Zanzibar. What Zanzibar is comprises of Unguja and Pemba. So I want you to be specific on which of these islands that he really studied, and he carried out some of his activities. And my question is don't you think that this issue of idea of Salafism has to do with the influence of some certain cultural centers, for example, the Egyptian center that was established in Dar es Salaam? And do you think that those centers have...
Is that Farida? No, I'm not in the room. Are you already there?
Do you think that these centers have
Okay,
influence
you have to come downstairs.
in grooming some of these particular Salafists? And the other question or observation I'm making is I don't know whether you are aware of the activities of Sheikh Fonda in Dar es Salaam, and his engagement with the state I believe he's still active in Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, we have to take a seat.
I'm having a problem. I'm running out of power, and I'm going. And it's not
okay. Oui.
working.
Is it working down here?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. If I'm on this video, that I presume means that the internet is not working. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to Cameroon either, which unfortunately due to teaching was not possible, but I hope the conference will go very well. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Jihadi conflict in northern Mozambique, a conflict which started in 2017. And what I want to talk to you about today is about the origin, the nature, and the evolution of that conflict. So let me start with the nature of the conflict. On a picture here, the insurgent took the district of Kisanga, the capital town of Kisanga. And as the picture shows, and the title of my conference already indicated, this is a jihadi conflict. It is the theme of the conference. But there is still much of debate, and there are contextual information I need to give you, and this is what I'll do in this section. Mozambique is in southern Africa, Southeast Africa, as it used to be called, and the conflict which is unfolding at present since 2017 has been taking place in the province of Cabo Delgado. You see on the map here on the left at the right top, the 11th province of Cabo Delgado in the extreme north. The capital is in Maputo at the extreme south. So a province which is very far away from the capital, as you can see. And on the right-hand side map, you can see that the conflict did not take place in the whole of the province either. It is really taking place in half of the province, mostly the coastal areas. And this has been the situation since the beginning, and it has been, surprisingly, pretty stable. There was a moment when the insurgents spread into Niassa last year, and they stayed there 1-2 months, and then they withdrew. So it has been a surprisingly stable, geographically speaking, conflict in the extreme north of Mozambique. This being said, the conflict actually has a wider impact. The image here is from the United Nations, and it talks about, it puts into graphic the situation of IDPs, displaced peoples and refugees. And what you can see is a lot of people displaced within the province of Cabo Delgado, but then into the other provinces of Niassa on the west and Nampula in the south. Both provinces which are deemed by most scholars and analysts to be at risk of seeing an expansion of the insurgency. So while I was telling you in a previous slide that the conflict was very geographically limited, it is actually impacting a much wider area, and of course it's impacting the whole country in terms of economy, reputation, military situation, etc. The conflict began in 2017, I was telling you, and since then there has been a lot of debate as to the cause and the nature, the origins of the conflict. Here are a few snapshots on the slide which show you some of the explanation, the dominant, I would say, explanation about poverty being a cause, about war resource-rich province, the fact that a huge gas industry is being developed, the biggest private investment in Africa is taking place in the middle of the area where the insurgency is happening. So people see a causality there. Like the BBC talks about gas and rubies as the cause, and others at the bottom right see rather, that is another line of explanation, the fact that insurgent jihadists are moving south from Somalia down to Kenya, down to Tanzania, and they would have reached Mozambique. It's kind of a domino theory if you're thinking of Cold War theories. And this is really the big debate about whether the insurgency is external or not, and whether it has anything to do with religion, or is it resources, or is it poverty. My own line, as you will see, is a slightly different one. I think what is happening is there are grievances which people react to. Hence, poverty is certainly a factor, as well as the development of these resources, whether it's gas or rubies. But there is also a project, which is what attracts people, which allows them to transform the grievances into a political project, which they're ready to fight for. And this project, as you would expect at this conference, is of course a jihadi one. And this is what is drawing people to the insurgency in the majority, I would argue, and certainly the leaders. Let me talk to you now about the origins of the insurgency. I did a research project on the insurgency, and what I decided to do as people were looking into resources and all sorts of explanation is actually to look at the first attack of the insurgent and try to figure out what they said, who they were, and what they were, where they were coming from. So I did an investigation myself with a team of researchers, interviews, visits in different places. And we interviewed a series of people. Here is a picture of the wife of a dead leader before the insurgency turned violent, actually. And what I uncovered very rapidly, which was well known locally, is that very much like the situation in northern Nigeria, the situation of the insurgent, called locally Al-Shabaab, has to do with a sect which had begun way before the insurgency began, probably 10 years before, which developed in northern Mozambique. They wanted to establish a Sharia rule society, and they entered in conflict with both Sufi and Islamist, actually, Wahhabi Muslims, and they decided then to withdraw, to establish their own mosque, but eventually also to cut off from society, to prevent their members to go to school, to contact the justice system, the police, and even cut off from their family. And the sect members established a series of mosques and proceeded to build a counter society. And this situation lasted for probably 10 years before it shifted and became violent, turning from an Islamist sect into a jihadi insurgency. The sect began, its very origins are not very clear. I was told it might have connection to previous sects in the north of the province, and maybe not. It was not very sure. I can't find people who testified to the event, a sect that was repressed in the 1990s. In any case, this sect began, from my documentation, around 2007, that is 10 years before the insurgency began, and it spread across northern Mozambique, mostly Cabo Delgado, as you can see on this map, which I did for an article I published. This map has been adapted because I've uncovered since that the sect had a presence, and when I mean a presence, that is a mosque and a series of houses, a compound around it, in the province of Niassa to the west of Cabo Delgado, but also further south into Nampula province. So the sect had quite a wide, in northern Mozambique, presence, quite a wide presence. And in some areas, it was actually repressed. These are the white stars on the map I have here, and the places in black is where the state did not repress it. And the story of repression is a complicated one, a long one. Some of the repression started very early on, and they were just expelled. In other cases, the sect turned violent in 2015-16, violent as in interrupting classes, ceremonies, state ceremonies, which they condemned, and seeing violence and dead people. So people being imprisoned in that case. And I think there's a story which I sketch a little bit in the article, but I think we need to dig a lot more about the radicalization of the sect from an Islamist sect into jihadi insurgency. And my hypothesis is that the sect lived quite happily for many years, was repressed a bit, but not too much. And it managed to expand and live quite happily, if I may say so. But at some point, the situation changed and the repression became more systematic. Repression not only by the state, but actually by other Muslim leaders and a community. And the one which was most active were the Wahhabi, who really clashed very strongly with the insurgent. They had very similar views in different respects, and as to establishing a separate society, rejecting the state. That was the key disagreement. There were other issues about how they prayed, how they behaved, etc., etc. So the repression began, I think, around 2015 and increased to 2017. And my hypothesis, I was telling you, is that this radicalized the sect thinking, well, we can't live outside of society. They won't allow us. Hence, we need to change the state. They organized, according to several sources, trained, and then went on the attack in October 2017. Let me talk to you finally about the evolution of the insurgency. It started in 2017 as a very small affair. The first attack saw men with 1-2 guns attack with mostly machete police station to steal armament. The clash in the town of Mocimboa da Praia lasted 48 hours. They stole quite a few guns and then disappeared in the bush, in the forest in that case. And the situation has evolved significantly since. In the first couple of months, the government argued that this was just a police affair, nothing very important, and they went on the hunt. The insurgent hid in a forest, first in a village actually, then in a forest, etc. And they made very few attacks against state officials, the police, usually at night, in very discreet fashion and very opportunistic fashion. Things change. A year later, they started attacking villages, mostly at night, but soon during the day as well. Then they started attacking roads and transport on roads, and they gained confidence and they started attacking small towns. And things increased until 2019, when they had become significantly better organized and more forceful and better armed, and they started attacking district headquarters. And 2019 and 2020, they even captured a series of district headquarters. I show you that picture at the very beginning, if you remember, about the post of Kisanga, and that was one where they made a video claiming they were being successful and called on people to join them. So that is one level of evolution of the insurgency. It has grown, it has not expanded, but it has gained strength. And we are now looking at an insurgency which, according to some information, would be flying drones and have very good equipment with cars, with telephone computers, with an insurgency which had, I would argue, become quite sophisticated. This is a slide with two images of the insurgency, how it started. The first video they published within months, where they were stuttering and arguing, a very short video, badly done. The one on the right is 2020, if I'm not mistaken, where the insurgent actually made a very sophisticated discourse, a political discourse, which they broadcasted themselves. You can see out of the attire how they changed from having a few guns to actually wearing military equipment, and even the posture, I would argue, within the image tells you quite a bit about the evolution. Beside the growth of the insurgency, of course, the great novelty and evolution is its connection to the Islamic State. Islamic State or Daesh, that's what's behind the film here. The insurgents seem to have connected to ISIS very early on. As they started fighting, it seems, they made a pledge, possibly in 2018, and then they renewed the pledge which ISIS made public, hence recognizing it. So since 2018, the insurgency has been an ISIS-affiliated organization, which has, needless to say, sparked a lot of concern in the international community, the US, European, and Southern African states. It has led to change in communication. Part of the communication were videos which went through WhatsApp and circulated in uncontrolled fashion. Now it is messages which are polished through ISIS, which is a very at the beginning was not very well done. Now it's very precise, very fast. The names mentioned by ISIS are correct, etc. Since last year, there is an international intervention with Rwandan, the SADC, several states doing an intervention trying to help the Mozambican government with much success. But ISIS has responded to that with, that is the image on the left here, propaganda against Rwanda, which they circulated worldwide on their media. And we presume, or I presume, because I do not have intelligence connections, that they have reinforced their support of the insurgents in Mozambique with training, with information, not just media, but possibly maybe even money and maybe men on the ground, most probably, to help them organize even better. And the big turning point before the intervention, the foreign intervention, was in last year, 2021 in March, when the insurgent captured not so much the gas, but the city next to the gas. And the attack was very sophisticated. And to some analysts, military analysts or security analysts, that was a sign that ISIS was actually helping them strategize and organize the tactics to capture very significant targets. So I'll conclude here. The insurgency has begun 2017, evolved significantly, I was telling you, and the situation more generally has evolved significantly with ISIS getting involved and the international community getting increasingly involved by now. I think a very fruitful comparison is one with the situation in Nigeria. And with colleagues, we sometimes laugh at the similarities of how the state reacts, the conspiracy theories which circulate, and the stages of analysis which are going on. The photograph here is the very first day of the insurgency in Mocimboa da Praia. There is, however, still a lot to be researched on this topic, and I hope all my little sketch has done is give you some ideas of the issues, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Du lac Tchad, une fois de plus. Donc, si la technique est prête, on peut donner la parole à Bashir Salau. Merci.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Nigeria. I couldn't make it to Cameroon, but this is a big leap for me, moving from the 19th century to the more contemporary work. So this is my first paper on the Boko Haram insurgency, and I'm thinking of developing it into a book project. My title has changed a little bit. It's now Yakowa's Nightmare, Boko Haram Attacks on Kaduna State from 2010 to 2012. My paper uses a series of Boko Haram attacks on Kaduna State to reflect on the causes of Boko Haram violent extremism and on government reactions to relevant attacks. Drawing mainly on newspapers, reports, and secondary sources, the paper ties government's reaction to growing popular discontent, and it undermines conventional interpretations on the causes of Boko Haram violence extremisms. While it is widely recognized that Boko Haram carried out many attacks in Kaduna State, what is less obvious in the commentaries on this attack is why they were carried out against specific targets and how the governors of Kaduna State responded to the attacks. This is the case in part because despite their contributions to our understanding of several issues, no study on the Boko Haram movement has comprehensively covered the Kaduna State region. By contrast, this paper seeks to examine Boko Haram attacks on Kaduna State during the tenure of Patrick Yakowa as the governor of the state. Yakowa served as governor from 20 May 2010 to 15 December 2012. A focus on his brief period is important because it allows us to understand not only how the first and only Christian governor of Kaduna State reacted to the Boko Haram attacks, but also how his reaction shaped public views of his administration. A focus on these periods also allows us to contribute to the literature on the causes of Boko Haram violent extremism. Some studies dedicated to examining the cause of Boko Haram attacks stress the root causes of violence and argue that the relevant terrorist attacks will persist in the long run if the root causes are not addressed. The studies that emphasize the interpretation that Boko Haram attacks will end once the root causes are identified and removed can be divided into at least two general categories: those drawing on the social identity theory and those advancing the poverty theory. The social identity approach ties violence to tensions created by groups' desire to affirm its social identity. In works that deal with Boko Haram, those who embrace this approach often link the religious component of social identity to relevant violence. They stress that the Boko Haram movement developed a shared group identity that includes attitudes, beliefs, experiences, and interests of insiders or of in-group members. They also stress that this shared identity is strengthened through the attainment of a collectively professed aim to rid Nigeria of corruption and poor governance by instituting an Islamic state. Finally, they stress that given the religious identity of the Boko Haram movement and considering the belief of the members of the movement that they practice the true and unadulterated Islam, two things are not surprising. First, that any perceived assault on the group identity is an important instigator of terrorist attacks, and that Boko Haram members are open to killing non-believers and those they consider nominal Muslims who refuse to convert to their form of Islam. The poverty theory approach ties violence to socio-economic factors. In works that deal with Boko Haram, those who embrace this approach often link Boko Haram attacks to social and economic decay. In so doing, they stress the high level of poverty, illiteracy, and such other conditions, especially in contemporary northern Nigeria, and argue that the marginalized people in this region turn to religion and relevant violent extremism in search of how to empower themselves. In addition, some of those who employ the poverty theory approach argue that social and economic decay stimulated violent extremism because it encouraged the politicization of religious traditions and the radicalization of religious communities. In another explanation within the poverty theory approach, some scholars tie psychological feelings to violence. Those who embrace this approach argue that in comparing their socio-economic conditions to those of other groups in Nigeria, members of the Boko Haram movement perceive themselves to be unfairly treated by the Nigerian state, and they perceive the state in question as the persecutor of true Muslims, as well as the major obstacle to true Islamic reforms. They argue further that Boko Haram violent extremism is the result of the anger and resentment caused by this sense of relative deprivation. The various root cause explanations described above have several limitations. They do not explain why root causes are not slowly related to the Boko Haram violent extremism, or why they are not related to other non-Boko Haram-led violent extremisms in terms of the social outcome that each of them produces, and they do not explain why Boko Haram selected specific targets, or at least some of the targets they attack. In addition, they do not explain why a root cause leads to Boko Haram attacks in some cases and not in others. Another problem is that they present Boko Haram members as passive objects of psychological, social, and economic forces, or as pawns who have no option but to do what those root causes force them to do. While some scholars stress the root causes of relevant violence, others emphasize the trigger factors or the immediate events and circumstances that inspired Boko Haram attacks. For instance, in stressing such short and direct link between cause and outcome, some writers have identified security deficiency, endemic elite corruption, and military brutality, continued economic challenges, decrepit and underdevelopment infrastructures, and inadequate reporting as trigger factors for Boko Haram violent extremism. However, the problem with the interpretation offered by these scholars is that they do not distinguish between trigger factors and root causes. Moreover, as other writers who have pointed to the direct causal relationship between Boko Haram attacks and triggering effects, they ignore the fact underlying all trigger effects are background conditions, which often include a long process of radicalization that prepares the group for relevant extreme actions. In this paper, I seek to test the different theories on the causes of Boko Haram extremism, even though I, unlike previous writers, identified two types of causes of Boko Haram extremism. These two types are the preconditions and the trigger or precipitants. I seek to stress that the Boko Haram attacks on Kaduna State during the Yakowa era did not have a single cause. Before embarking on my analysis, it is useful to introduce Kaduna State and to provide a chronology of Boko Haram attacks in the state during the Yakowa era. Kaduna State is located in north-central Nigeria, but it is distantly located to northeastern region of Borno, where the Boko Haram movement was founded and has been centered. Historically, two broad cultural groups of roughly equal size occupy Kaduna State. The two groups are the Muslim Hausa Fulani and the non-Muslim population consisting of 30 minority ethnic groups. The former dominates the traditional governance, developed enclaves throughout non-Muslim territories, and dominates the modern political system. The underdevelopment of the southern parts of Kaduna State and of non-Muslim enclaves encourage the ethnic minority elites, who are mainly Christians, to persistently attack the hegemony of Muslim Hausa Fulani in the state and elsewhere in Nigeria. It also led to violent agitation and confrontations. In addition to the underdevelopment of the southern territories, other factors that helped to promote recurring ethno-religious conflict in Kaduna State before the Yakowa era include the politicization of religion and the high level of poverty, even in Muslim enclaves within the state. Concerned about the recurring ethno-religious conflict in Kaduna State, the state government, religious bodies, and NGOs worked together to ensure that relative peace existed in the state, at least between 2002 and 2010. Although Kaduna State did not witness any large-scale violence within this period, the ethnic minority elites and non-Muslims who felt marginalized in the political milieu continued to fight for political empowerment. Ultimately, for the first time in Kaduna State history, a Christian and non-Hausa from southern Kaduna, Patrick Yakowa, was sworn in as governor on 20 May 2010. During the short tenure of Yakowa, Boko Haram attacked Kaduna City and other parts of the state. It attacked both Muslims and Christians. And it targeted newspapers, banks, markets, military institutions, churches, mosques, defectors, and so on. The chronology of Boko Haram attacks in Kaduna State during this period that I'm focusing on is featured in my paper. Let me turn to the issue of the causes of the attacks on Kaduna State. In Kaduna State, suicide mission was the most lethal tactics employed by Boko Haram during the period under study. The suicide bombers who participated in the relevant attacks included men and women. Although this writer has not come across any record left behind by any of these bombers, there's evidence that dogmatic fervor in the form of religious conviction and that they will enjoy benefits after death, or more broadly, in the form of the belief that the benefits of executing suicide attacks outweigh the cost, made them willing to risk their lives and kill other people. Despite the existence of such fervor, however, there is no evidence indicating that dogmatic fervor on the level of the individual bombers was a factor in the selection of the Boko Haram targets in Kaduna State. The dogmatic fervor on the level of the individual bomber, that was not a factor in the selection of Boko Haram targets in Kaduna State, does not mean that religious extremism did not play some role. Indeed, in some various statements claiming responsibility for various attacks in Kaduna State, Boko Haram stressed various ostensibly religious justifications for related violence. For instance, in claiming responsibility for the attack of the Zaria city resident of Vice President Narmadi Sambo, Boko Haram stressed that the attack or only kill unbelievers, and that their crusade is not for personal gains. It is meant to ensure the establishment of an Islamic state by liberating all Muslims from the excesses of the infidels. Similarly, while emphasizing such religious justifications, in claiming responsibility for attacks on churches located in Kaduna and Zaria City, the group said their increasing onslaught through suicide bombing of churches are meant to avenge the many atrocities which the Christians perpetrated against the Muslims in different parts of the country in the past few years. By stressing that the selected church targets due to their anger over what the Christians did against the Muslims in the past, Boko Haram was putting Christians on notice that if they continue to harm Muslims, they will pay a price. Moreover, in claiming the responsibility for the attack on the
2 more minutes to conclude, please.
I'm going to skip other discussion there, but let me say that also stress other important factors in addition to inaccurate reporting, indignation over government betrayal, and atrocities.
Bashir, we've got to interrupt because we're running out of time.
Okay, I'm going to conclude.
Good.
Right? Okay. And my conclusion is also, the point is, the aim of all of this is to show that the Boko Haram were not passive actors. They took decisions in deciding what targets they will attack during this particular period, and that their actions ultimately led to discontent, which affected the image and the of Yakowa, and led to the call by a lot of people for his resignation from power, and he died under that context. Overall, therefore, what I'm saying is that we have to recognize that there are some preconditions that are very important causes for this problem. At the same time, we also have to recognize the trigger factors that are responsible for the violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bashir. Now we have 15 minutes for questions and answers. So present yourself.
We have to reduce it to
10. We reduce to 10 minutes for questions and answers. Okay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons eu cet après-midi 4 excellentes présentations. Mon intervention va se concentrer sur celle de notre ami Alessio. Vous avez parlé de Boko Haram, mais pour nous qui travaillons sur Boko Haram, il y a 2 dates structurantes dans la vie de Boko Haram. Et lorsque Boko Haram a fait allégeance à l'État islamique en mars 2015 pour devenir la province de l'État islamique en Afrique de l'Ouest, et puis la scission de 2016, parce que c'est à la faveur de cette scission de 2016 que Barnawi et Nour se sont réfugiés dans le bassin du lac Tchad. Avant, tout le monde était à Sambisa plutôt que dans le bassin du lac Tchad. Vous n'avez pas évoqué ces 2 questions. Est-ce que ça veut dire qu'elles n'ont pas leur importance pour vous? Et puis la deuxième chose sur laquelle vous interrogez, vous avez semblé expliquer la scission entre Barnawi et Nour d'un côté et Chekau de l'autre, par des divergences idéologiques. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas d'autres raisons? Parce que le prêche que nous avons récupéré en Hausa de 2 heures, juste avant l'exécution de Chekau, pas de Chekau, juste avant l'exécution de Nour, dans le prêche de 2 heures que nous avons retranscrit en Hausa, les autres semblaient expliquer l'exécution de Nour par ses liens avec la Croix-Rouge avec laquelle il aurait négocié de l'argent. Est-ce que cette version vous paraît bonne? Et puis, dernière question à notre ami Mourier-Genoud. Dans le cas, s'il m'écoute bien sûr, oui. Dans le cas du Mozambique, on a vu que tout le monde s'est mis d'accord rapidement pour trouver une solution. Est-ce que c'est parce qu'il y a un enjeu financier important, puisqu'on sait que Total va investir 25 milliards de dollars dans le bassin gazier du Mozambique? Est-ce que c'est parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'argent en jeu que tout le monde s'est mis d'accord? Le Rwanda a envoyé des forces pour chasser les djihadistes et aujourd'hui tout le monde est content. Est-ce que c'est parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'enjeux financiers et que Boko Haram ni le Nord Mali n'intéressent pas les gens parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup d'argent? Merci.
Oui, s'il vous plaît, ma question, je la pose à votre voisin. J'ai deux questions et une question à votre voisin, une deuxième question à la télévision. Première question à votre voisin. Il a parlé, soit est structuré, bien développé, avec un contexte géographique et social. Je ne comprends pas. Est-ce qu'il peut un peu nous situer ce contexte géographique des SWAP et ce contexte social? Ça veut dire quoi? Est-ce qu'il y a une communauté, une race, une ethnie, ou un gouvernement qui est bien organisé au sein des SWAP? C'est ça? Je n'ai pas compris. C'est un. De deux, Boko Haram a commencé comme amusement dans l'état de Borno. Et subitement, on nous a fait comprendre, ils sont déjà à Yobe State, Adamawa State, et puis aujourd'hui, tout à l'heure, je venais d'entendre Kaduna, tout ça. C'est pas grave. Boko Haram, au niveau du Cameroun, c'est dans les trois départements de la région de l'extrême nord. Mayo Sava, Logone Chari et Mayo Sava, Logone Chari et Naga. Ça, les trois départements. Mais à ma grande surprise, qu'est-ce qui justifie la prolifération de Boko Haram jusqu'à Mozambique? Voilà mes deux questions. Merci.
Si, les deux dernières questions là-bas. Oui. Bon, vous allez juste.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Daniel Iweze from University of Benin, Nigeria. My question goes to the last speaker. In Kaduna State, there has been a spate of killings, kidnapping, and banditry in Kaduna State, and this has also expanded to attack on transport infrastructure like the railway between Kaduna and Abuja, and even the airport. And also many military formations have been attacked by these gangs that come under the guise of bandits and kidnappers. Don't you think they are also the Boko Haram that have been dispersed? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question. Ivory Coast.
Well, if you look at their style of bombing and kidnapping and so on, their similarity indicate, there are so many reports trying to indicate that the bandits are working hand in hand with the Boko Haram group. So it is likely that in the Kaduna State, all of those attacks are also related to Boko Haram activities.
The last question, and then we give the answers.
OK. Ma préoccupation s'adresse à Alessio. On sait que Boko Haram est apparu autour de 2009, pratiquement au moment de la forte pénétration d'Internet en Afrique. Et tout à l'heure, dans votre approche méthodologique, vous avez parlé d'enquête ethnographique. Est-ce que cette démarche a intégré l'ethnographie digitale? Et si oui, comment est-ce que vous vous êtes pris? Quels sont les défis méthodologiques qui se posent à ce niveau-là?
Merci. Nous commençons par Alessio, then Farah, et puis on will conclude.
Bon, merci. Merci pour toutes les questions. Je serai extrêmement vite. Je vais répondre à toutes les questions d'abord à mon ami Sidi Kabab. Oui, bien sûr, les dates clés du développement du phénomène de Boko Haram sont ceux que vous avez cités. Moi, j'ai décidé de les réencadrer dans un terme plus narratif, si vous voulez, autour de la question de Daoula et autour de la question des éléments de Dapsi. Mais, si vous voulez, sont plus ou moins les mêmes événements liés au même fait. Et par rapport à les autres raisons qui, justement, vous avez citées, moi, j'espère aussi de répondre au monsieur dont je ne me rappelle pas le nom, vous m'excusez. ma ambition avec cette présentation et ce travail, c'est pas de donner une étude omnicompréhensive du phénomène Boko Haram, c'est pas une économie politique. Je voulais simplement cibler et me concentrer sur les aspects intellectuels du mouvement, parce que les aspects matériaux liés à la gouvernance politique, ainsi dite, ou aux questions économiques, moi, je l'ai déjà affronté dans des autres travaux. J'avais plus envie de revenir sur ça. Je voulais me concentrer un peu plus sur les développements intellectuels et les interactions avec les groupes liés à l'État islamique central. Et par rapport à la première raison que vous avez, moi, j'ai bénéficié de votre traduction en Hafsa de Feisal de Nour. Et oui, voilà. Moi, j'ai décidé encore une fois de me concentrer plutôt sur certains aspects plus liés au côté intellectuel du mouvement. Mais bien sûr, ce que vous citez, la raison pratique liée à les liens entre Mohamad Nour et la Croix-Rouge, c'est la raison principale de cette exécution. Aussi la raison juridique, si vous voulez. Mais moi, j'ai voulu les mettre dans un contexte plus vaste des questions intellectuelles. Par rapport au contexte social, moi, je reviens aussi, moi, je voulais me concentrer plutôt sur certains aspects et pas sur le contexte social, parce qu'autrement, j'aurais dû faire une leçon de 1h30 et ça, ce n'était pas le cas pour la conférence. Mais bien sûr, nous, on a fait, moi notamment, avec mes collègues, on a fait une éthographie très longue. Du coup, on connaît bien tout l'environnement autour du lac Tchad. Et je vais très vite aussi pour répondre à la dernière question par rapport à l'éthographie digitale. Alors, moi, je suis seulement une dernière arrivée, si vous voulez, dans l'éthographie digitale, parce qu'on a commencé, ça a commencé à arriver un volume incroyable de documents, de publications, de produits culturels, si vous voulez. On a commencé doucement à l'analyser. Et au niveau méthodologique, on cherche d'avoir les mêmes soucis qu'on a quand on fait l'éthnographie normale. Oui, évidemment, on a un autre niveau de soucis, des attentions, on peut dire, qu'on va donner à ce type d'éthnographie. Et pour ne pas élever trop de temps, si vous voulez, on peut échanger par rapport à ça après, si vous voulez. Merci bien.
Question from Ibrahim Kankara. Yes, so, well, do not confuse Kenya and Tanzania with the coast. The coast is almost like a different parts of the coastal areas are Swahili. So what goes on in Zanzibar might affect people in Mombasa. There's relations between Mombasa and Zanzibar, or maybe Dar es Salaam on the coast, but not. But of course, the Swahili language is spoken in Tanzania, but the coast is where the culture, where Islam is, in terms of. But in terms of this, I've never heard of Sheikh Bonda, but I'm assuming that he's one of those Wahubiri or Dini Islam. So these are missionaries. These are different people there are different streams of Islam. These are the guys who just do the missionary towards Christians, and the other ones were, working on within Islam itself. So these are two different groups of people. Thank you.
Thank you. If Eric Mourier is getting us, are you hearing us? Yes, you can answer the question.
Oui, tout à fait. Est-ce que vous m'entendez, moi?
Okay, yes, go on, please.
Monsieur le Président, merci. Écoutez, merci infiniment pour la participation et merci pour la question qui est très judicieuse. Pourquoi est-ce que tout le monde est d'accord pour la solution au Mozambique? Et je crois que la question donnait la réponse en partie et c'est correct. Il y a un accord en général car il y a d'énormes investissements au Mozambique pour le gaz et c'est le plus grand investissement privé en Afrique. Donc, c'est vraiment un enjeu financier très grand et qui conditionne évidemment l'intervention au Mozambique. Mais en apparence, tout le monde a l'air d'accord, mais en réalité, c'est beaucoup plus compliqué. D'abord, il y a la question militaire, ensuite, il y a la question sociale et politique. Donc, il y a un accord pour une intervention militaire qui a pris pas mal de temps. Le Rwanda est arrivé avant la communauté de l'Afrique australe, ce qui a créé des problèmes. Donc, il y a Il y a des problèmes de relationnement entre les différents pays et la manière dont le Mozambique gère ça. Et ensuite, il y a toute la question de ces programmes de combattre l'extrémisme violent que différents pays aimeraient faire, des organisations au Mozambique aimeraient mettre en pratique, et le gouvernement mozambicain n'est pas très favorable. Et donc, on n'a quasiment aucun travail qui est fait au niveau social. L'Union européenne, avec les États-Unis et la Banque mondiale, essaye de mettre en place un programme de développement et de résolution de conflits dans le nord du Mozambique, un programme de 2 milliards ou 2,5 milliards de dollars. Et le gouvernement traîne depuis 6 mois à ne pas vouloir accepter le programme. Donc, il y a des désaccords sur l'analyse qui est faite et comment le programme sera fait. Donc, en apparence, vous avez tout à fait raison, il y a un accord plus grand parce que les enjeux sont plus grands, mais sous la surface, je dirais, c'est beaucoup plus compliqué et il y a des tensions, évidemment.
Merci à tous les panélistes. Et nous avons terminé. Je vous remercie également pour vos questions et ces échanges assez intéressants. Merci beaucoup.